These days, it's hard to surprise anyone with a new video game release. Big budget titles drop pretty often, and even major launches tend to, so to speak, fly under the radar for most players. Still, I remember when Control came out in 2019. That felt like a real event. Not only did the game expand Remedy's so-called connected universe, but it was also one of the very first titles to use ray tracing, a cutting-edge technology at the time that everyone was hyping like crazy. Back then I had to skip the game altogether simply because I didn't have a console or a decent PC capable of running it properly. Control caught my attention because it belongs to a rare breed of games centered around supernatural powers. They used to come out more often and had distinctive feel to them. For example, I can recall Advent Rising from 2005, a title that definitely deserves its own video. Nowadays you mostly get shooters where powers are just an extra gimmick, like in Destiny for example. So that old school vibe really intrigued me. I had already played Quantum Break from the same developer by then, and while I appreciated the unique TV show style of storytelling, those who've played it know what I mean, the gameplay itself felt a bit too simplistic. So I kept an eye on Control, though I tried to watch out for spoilers. Jumping ahead a bit, I'll say this. Overall, I am satisfied with the game, though I do have some portion of criticism. To me, Control turned out to be like an uncut diamond, a game that just needed a bit more polish to become truly phenomenal. The first 3 or 4 hours, honestly, I had to force myself to keep playing. I just couldn't get into it. But once it clicked, it was hard to stop. And on that positive note, let's move on to breaking down Control. One quick note. I played it on a base PS5 in performance mode, so the visuals naturally look a bit better on PC, if that matters to anyone. Now let's start with a short look at the game's development history. One of the most distinctive traits of Remedy as a developer is how creatively they approach the process of making games. They often drop bits of secret information, host special community events, and even their developer diaries are something, filled with acting, symbolism, and kind of quirky charm that makes their marketing stand out and often brings a smile. For example, there's a video tour of the Remedy office featuring Courtney Hope, the actress who played the game's protagonist. In that video, she stays in character as her in-game persona while walking through the studio and sharing fun facts about their workplace. So even their dev diaries feel different, more like performance art than promotional material. Speaking of facts, Control, unlike Alan Wake or Quantum Break, was a much more commercial project. Those two titles took 7 and 5 years to develop respectively, while Control was done in just 3. The budget was around 30 million euros, which isn't that much for an ambitious AAA production. That's an important point I'll come back to later. From a creative standpoint, Remedy needed a way to tie all their storylines into a single shared universe. That's where Control steps onto the stage. According to the developers, in Quantum Break, they first built the characters and then the world. With Control, they have reversed the process. They built the world first and then the other things. And honestly, they poured a ton of attention into this aspect. Rightfully so, because it's easily one of the best parts of the game. The environment isn't static, it's alive, interesting, and even mysterious. Those who've played it know exactly what I mean. Beyond the creative side, technology played a huge role too. As I mentioned before, Control was one of the first games to use ray tracing and DLSS upscaling. For physics, they moved away from the popular Havoc and adopted NVIDIA's physics. NVIDIA, in fact, heavily invested in promoting the game. The company pushed it hard, which made sense because Control showcased their new technologies. That dynamic shifting environment, unpredictable and surreal, was a key part of the vision, and they absolutely nailed it. The world of Control isn't just abstract, it's functional, tangible, and constantly reacting to you. But despite all the paranormal stuff that Remedy's games are known for, their stories are still told through a deeply human lens, through characters and their perception of reality. And beyond the writing, one thing I've always appreciated about Remedy is their casting. Control is no exception. For the lead role, they chose Courtney Hope. You wouldn't call her a famous Hollywood actress, more like a solid B-tier performer, but she absolutely nailed it here. It's hard to imagine anyone else in her place. Plus, she had already worked with Remedy before on Quantum Break, so the choice felt natural. However, for me personally, the true star of the game is James McCaffrey, one of my all-time favorite voice actors in gaming. Unfortunately, he passed a few years back. Most people know him as Max Payne, probably his most iconic role.
Good conversation. Sam was talking about possibly doing something, and would I be interested in working with him? And we said absolutely.
I still hadn't really forgiven myself for the Mona business, but I knew that was just grief. The insanity that comes with losing the life you had built.
He also was never a huge celebrity, despite his legendary status among fans. But his talent was undeniable. In Control, he voiced the former bureau director. His screen time wasn't massive, but every scene he was in was an absolute treat to listen to. With that, let's move on to the game's visual presentation. When it comes to the visual part of the game, Control has a lot of distinctive and truly unique qualities. But in my opinion, above all else, what truly stands out is the artistic side of the game. If I had to describe the art style in just two words, they would be abstractionism and emphasis. Control absolutely loves drawing your attention, highlighting and carefully hinting the player at specific places or events. Just let's think about how the game presents new locations. There's nothing complicated, just big white text splashed across half the screen with a sharp sound effect. But let's focus not only on the aesthetic side, but also on the narrative design that exists between the lines, like something happening behind the scenes of gameplay. This artistic choice serves several purposes. Aesthetically, it's striking. Functionally, it introduces new locations, helping the game's progression feel smoother. And dramatically, it adds a sense of structure and rhythm to Jessie's journey. It's as if those location titles act as narrative checkpoints, marking her next step forward. And that's just one small example of how art direction works here. If we look at Remedy's games as a whole, they've often lacked a bit of deeper gameplay polish or perfectly cohesive storytelling. But artistically, they've always been on another level. The same was true with Alan Wake. It wasn't just about how well the lighting and shadows were done technically, but how they are integrated into the world and how they served a narrative function through visual storytelling. Control does exactly the same thing. Everything here feels like one cohesive organism. Cinematography, atmosphere, and living aesthetics all tied together. The artistic direction isn't just decoration. You almost can't touch it through the game. Back at the time, Control was praised for a reason. That rich, hovering sense of style, and a lot of that came from lessons learned during Quantum Break, where Remedy refined many of the visual and conceptual ideas that later became core to Control. From the technical side, as I mentioned before, the visuals are supported by great physics and clever lighting. To be honest, physics in games are my weakness. I have a hard time enjoying static environments, even if it's exaggerated ragdolls or the kind of clunky object interaction we had back in mid-2000s. I need that sense of physicality, and honestly, the way Control plays with physics brought me so much joy. I felt like a kid in a sandbox. Watching everything shatter, scatter, and crumble was incredibly satisfying. And it's not just random objects on levels, the entire environment reacts. What's even cooler is that this whole interplay between light and physics is built logically in the world itself. But the true gems of Control's visual design are its environments and visual effects. Everything works together like a well-oiled mechanism aimed at evoking specific emotions. Still, if I had to single out what drives this whole visual engine, it's those two things. The levels alone could be discussed for hours. As I mentioned before, the devs started building Control from this aspect. They gave the environment an insane amount of attention, and it shows. The whole aesthetic is built in brutalism. In Control, however, concrete becomes something more than just a depressing architectural choice. The oldest house, where the game's events takes place, it's a living structure. Halls expand, walls move, secret passages open. Normally, concrete textures in games make me feel bored, since they're mostly used in post-apocalyptic or modern settings. As a result, that grey monotony tends to get old really fast. But Control plays with its environment, constantly reshaping it so even ordinary offices, halls and maintenance sectors end up surprising you. On top of that, the game features a variety of biomes. Most of them are surreal abstractions, yet they retain clear geometric structure. The astral plane, a quarry inside a building, crystalline caves, each designed with surreal precision. It's hard to even imagine the full process of designing those levels, from the early concept art to texturing and final polish. And the cherry on top of this gorgeous cake, the visual effects. All those volumetric smokes, explosions and surreal distortions aren't just there to look pretty or cinematic. They reinforce meaning. We're not fighting regular humans here. We're battling a paranormal force called the Hiss. So when enemies dissolve into clouds of eerie smoke, it's not just visual flair, it's art direction reinforcing story. Overall, Control is one of those rare cases where a game isn't just technically beautiful, it's also conceptually and artistically fascinating. That combination doesn't happen often. At first, during the first few hours, I struggled to really get into it, but once it clicked, I couldn't stop playing. And the visuals, that's one of the aspects that truly hooked me.
Stroking my dick. I got lotion on my dick right now. I'm just stroking my shit. I'm horny as fuck.
Despite all of its strong artistic techniques on the visual side, the sound design in Control, for the first time in a long while, quite frankly burned itself into my memory. I honestly can't recall the last time I so clearly noticed specific sounds or artistic choices in this aspect. For me personally, sound design in games is usually perceived as a single cohesive element, a combination of tones, effects, and layers that merge into one complete picture. So if someone were to ask me right now to name a game where the sound design truly stood out, I'd probably struggle to come up with one. But Control is a completely different story. Just take the telekinesis sound, for example. On the surface, there are plenty of games where the player can use telekinetic powers, but the sound expression here, it's something else entirely. There's so much character, it's so crisp, if I can say so, and that's only one of dozens of specific examples. Then there's the whispering ambience scattered across the levels. more of a background layer than a foreground element, but it adds an eerie horror presence. Honestly, this might be the first game in years that I'd put on the same level as Silent Hill 2 when it comes to sound design. In Silent Hill 2, sound was one of the main tools for shaping the game's emotional impact. Control uses similar methods, not to scare, but to immerse. In Silent Hill, the sounds were crafted to shred your nerves in a horror setting where every creak could trigger panic. In Control, it's used more to create a dense atmosphere rather than to scare you. Unfortunately, the developers didn't talk much about the sound design or the music in their dev diaries, at least not as much as I'd have liked. But we have to get a glimpse of some very unusual instruments and setups they've used during production. It's one of those cases where it's almost impossible to explain it in words. You just have to feel it yourself. By now I think a few examples already give you the idea. I'll just say this: the sound design is so well executed that it actually overshadows the musical score. That's not to say the music is bad, it's quite good actually, but it's built on a very conceptual approach. The soundtrack is tightly bound to the gameplay moments, working in tandem with the sound effects instead of standing on its own. That's not a bad design choice at all, but it does mean you probably won't be listening to Control's tracks outside the game the same way you might revisit Silent Hill's beautiful compositions. Overall, the sound in Control left an incredibly strong impression on me. It's fascinating. The visuals are so unique that you'd think nothing could top them, but the audio here is so masterfully crafted that it easily stands on the same level in terms of pure quality. Absolutely a huge like from me on this one. And now, finally, we've reached the gameplay. And this is where the first cracks start to show. But let's take it one step at a time. Control is a dynamic third-person action game where we're constantly moving, shooting, and using special abilities. For Remedy, this game stands out because it's essentially their first semi-open world title. There's a map, there are control points, and you can fast travel between them. Still, even though Control gives you noticeably more freedom compared to their previous strictly linear games, to me it feels more like a collection of several dozen semi-open locations connected together. The world feels organic though, and any added freedom for the player is always welcome. Each level has a sort of thematic and conceptual division, especially in how the gameplay evolves. I've already mentioned that the environment spans a mix of biomes, mostly offices and halls, but as you progress, you'll explore labs, astral planes, and other strange spaces. It keeps the experience fresh and it reinforced by side quests and resource farming. The side content follows a traditional pattern. There's the main story campaign that unlocks new areas and pushes the narrative forward. There are secondary missions that usually explore smaller, contained stories, and then there are alerts, recurring encounters that spawn in random open locations. The game gives you the freedom to revisit your areas, but I wouldn't call it mandatory backtracking. What really forces you to return are the resources. The game's economy is fairly simple. You upgrade abilities with XP earned from the missions. You apply weapon mods and you apply attribute mods. The first part is straightforward. Complete missions, gain ability points, and upgrade your powers like telekinesis, shield, mind control, levitation, and so on. I'll go into more detail on that later. You can't fully upgrade everything in a single playthrough, but there's no strict need to. Even at base level, these powers are strong enough to handle most combat situations. Weapons, however, are a different story. In the game's lore, you're the director of the Federal Bureau of Control. But that title isn't something you choose, it's something you assigned to. And the director is chosen by the board through a special artifact called the service weapon. It's basically a shape-shifting sidearm, a pistol that can morph into a shotgun, an SMG, a rocket launcher, or even a railgun. Each of these forms must be unlocked. and then upgraded twice, each upgrade unlocking a new mod slot and increasing damage output. The catch is that upgrades require specific crafting materials. It's a familiar concept. We've seen it in plenty of games, but Control ties certain resources to specific zones. For example, in one area only a particular crafting material will drop. In my case, I needed 3 corrupted samples to upgrade my SMG form. The drop rate was fair. It didn't take hours of grinding. So what's the problem, you might ask? Well, the issue was that for more than half of my playthrough, I couldn't find more than 3 of these damn things. When I finally looked it up online, I discovered there was an optional location called the pit, where this exact resource spawns, meaning I could have finished the game without ever upgrading half of my weapons, and missed a chunk of content, just because the game decided to stay silent about where to find these drops. But even with the decent drop rates, I still had to clear this area several times, reloading saves just to make enemies respawn. And this grind isn't really optional, because the deeper you go, the tougher enemies become. Control uses a simplified level scaling system, similar to Borderlands. Sure, you can finish the main story without all of this, but you'll be missing over half the content. Attribute mods come with a different issue: a total lack of meaningful impact. This stuff drop by the dozens, especially toward the end. In theory, they are meant to let you customize your playstyle, granting bonuses like energy, more health, stronger telekinesis damage, a more durable shield, and so on. The problem is that Control doesn't have interesting mods that noticeably affect gameplay. Gain energy from hits while shielding, regain 10% health after a telekinesis kill, 30% ammo regen after mind controlling an enemy. Whoa. Truly special modifiers that completely redefine the gameplay experience. Weapon mods are slightly better, but still far from ideal. On paper, this system should have boosted replayability. In practice, most of my time went not into crafting creative builds, but into regularly clearing out my inventory from piles of junk. The funniest part, you can craft new random mods, but why would I, when the game already gives me dozens of them, most of which are useless? I found my best mods around the mid-game and kept them till the end. Occasionally, I swapped in stronger versions of the same stats, since mods also have tier levels. So you end up farming resources, slotting in some plus 10 to energy and then sorting through garbage again. The process gets tedious really fast. Like I said before, when it comes to story and gameplay, Remedy tends to struggle in delivering the end product. Thankfully, the combat system makes up for most of that. I've played plenty of similar titles, but damn, Control absolutely nails the feel of combat. Movement feels incredibly fluid, especially once you unlock levitation. Many other games overcomplicate ability usage. Here it's seamless and intuitive. You don't even have to aim directly at objects to throw them. The game does it for you. The abilities are nicely balanced. Telekinesis can nearly one-shot enemies, especially when throwing multiple objects, but it consumes a lot of energy. The shield isn't overpowered, and mind control doesn't turn enemies into the miracles. They mostly serve as distractions. Melee combat requires caution, and the dodge ability has a fairly long cooldown for what it is. So you're not some all-powerful god being. To survive, you've got to use all your abilities smartly and keep moving. What I love most is how Control handles positioning. I wouldn't call it a hard game, but it can definitely put you down if you're not careful. Before you level up your powers, you'll need to constantly stay mobile and pick your spots carefully. There's a good variety of enemies, and the AI actually coordinates. Some attack from above, others rushing close. You have to stay aware. The rhythm reminded me a lot of new Doom games, not even the 2016 reboot, but Eternal, where each enemy had a role. Control's combat follows the same philosophy, and aside from the main story, you'll also face elite enemies in optional missions and DLCs, so the game can throw a real challenge. As for the gunplay itself, I loved it. Shooting feels satisfying with solid weight and clear feedback on impact. I was pleasantly surprised by how well they implemented the cooldown system. I usually dislike shooters that rely on cooldowns instead of ammo, but here it feels natural and it perfectly fits with the game's internal logic. The last time I enjoyed something similar was in Titanfall 2, so hats off to Remedy. The one thing I didn't like, you can only equip 2 weapons at a time. If you want to switch to others, you have to open the menu. Why couldn't they just use a weapon wheel? Maybe you can call it a console limitation, since most buttons are already mapped to abilities, but still, holding the weapon swap button could have easily brought up a radio menu. Because of that small but annoying detail, I barely switched weapons and played most of the game with just 2 or 3. And overall, while the combat is cinematic and dynamic, it does get repetitive fast. Yes, it's fun. Yes, it's polished. But most of your powers are unlocked early on and barely evolve afterward, even with upgrades. The mods don't add anything new. Enemy variety is decent and there are even boss fights, but they don't fully save the same formula. Thankfully, the game isn't too long. The main story takes about 10 hours and the rest side quests and DLCs. I clocked around 21 hours total, and honestly I was forcing myself through one of the expansions. It's fun for about 10 hours, and then the interest just drops off a cliff. There's no real endgame, neither narrative nor mechanical. Everything built right. It just needs more depth, more fine-tuning. Same story as Alan Wake and Quantum Break. But if you set that aside, the core gameplay is fantastic, both as an action game in its own right and as a rare representative of the supernatural power subgenre. The combat sequences, I absolutely loved them. Now let's talk about the story component. Strangely enough, both the strongest and the weakest aspect of Control. Narratively, the game does an incredible job playing around with the popular American myths and conspiracies of the 20th century. Beyond all the media culture references, like jokes about the fake moon landing, you stumble upon all kinds of reader letters that were supposedly sent to newspapers, claiming things like planes aren't real, they're just TV projections, and so on. These little notes are cleverly woven into the game's strange mythical world, naturally reinforcing the setting instead of being lazy filler for a weak narrative. It's one of those rare cases where in-game documents enhance the story rather than replace it. As for the Remedy universe, there are references to Alan Wake, but they're subtle. We're referencing our other game, kind of nonsense. It all feels organic and justified. I came across a few references in the main campaign, and then, in the DLC dedicated to Alan Wake, there were a couple of cutscenes and a quest chain centered around fighting Heartmen. And yes, you'll have to battle the darkness again. That's actually a good addition, since Control's core mechanics get stale pretty fast, so any gameplay twist helps add variety. This DLC also serves as a bridge, connecting Control more closely to Alan Wake 2 rather than the first game. Remedy has officially merged some of its games into what they call the Remedy Connected Universe, the Alan Wake series and Control being the core of it. The rest aren't part of that yet, though Alan Wake has nods to Max Payne. Quantum Break was supposed to be the part of the same universe, but since Microsoft owns the licensing rights, it technically exists in a parallel reality. Also, both Control and Alan Wake explore ideas like the astral plane, other dimensions that make crossovers and interconnections between worlds and characters entirely possible. If I had to name my favorite Easter egg, it's the Thermos note. In Alan Wake, you had to collect thermoses as collectibles. In Control, some objects have paranormal properties, and there's a bureau document describing these thermos as having the supernatural ability to turn any coffee poured inside into a high-quality refreshing beverage. They even redacted who was collecting them. Brilliant touch. Now talking about the main plot. Normally I give a spoiler-free impression first, and then a breakdown for those who've already finished it. There's a ton of notes, abstract concepts, and non-linear storytelling that makes it rough to pin everything down. If I had to describe it simply, Control introduces us to the Federal Bureau of Control, a kind of paranormal FBI. It was founded sometime in the late 1940s, and in 1964 agents discovered something called the Oldest House in downtown New York. It looks like a massive concrete monolith, a place of power. Casual people can't perceive it, even if they do, they forget it soon after. Inside, the architecture constantly shifts and changes, so throughout the game you'll see surreal abstract level designs. The Bureau made it their headquarters. At the start, Jesse, our protagonist, enters the building, and only those who truly seek it can actually see it. The biggest issue with Control is that all the mysterious build-up, the secrets, the thrilling encounters with paranormal forces just collapse in the end due to a weak finale. The first Alan Wake left some things unanswered, some white spots that weren't fully explained, but its story still felt complete and compelling. Control tries to do the same, building tension and promising a massive payoff, and then just flushes all down the drain. They even toy with us. During the last mission, the game throws fake credits, like a meta joke that the ending's coming soon, and then bam, that's it. No real boss fight. The so-called final battle is just a 10-minute corridor sequence. All the creativity went into optional bosses. It really feels like they either ran out of money or ideas to finish the story properly. But if you ignore the disappointing ending, the world building is phenomenal. The way they use paranormal events inside the oldest house, how they tie them to the pop culture, and the way they create unique game scenarios, all of that is top tier. The story had the potential to deliver something truly memorable, but that weak finale just kills it. Maybe it wouldn't sting as much if Jesse, our protagonist, actually developed as a character over the story. The problem is, she doesn't change or evolve at all. Jesse who enters the oldest house is the same Jesse who leaves it. Sure, there are a few moments where we found out a few things about her past and her connection to the recent events, but it's nowhere near enough to save the narrative. I did like how they tried to give us glimpses into her inner thoughts. We often hear her inner monologue, which at least gives some depth. But honestly, aside from Jesse, the only character you'll remember is Alan Wake himself, who shows up briefly in the DLC. Everyone else feels like lifeless dolls that you immediately forget. Maybe you'll recall Casper Darwin, though I had to look up his name also. But he's just there to explain world mechanics. Jessie herself isn't particularly interesting either. No memorable personality traits, nothing compelling about her arc. Even Atsu from Ghost of Yotei was written better. And now I want to address the story with a few spoilers. If you plan to play, skip to the conclusion. Now for those who finished it. Did anyone actually enjoy the last hour of the story? I've seen a few Remedy fans defending it, saying the real story's in the documents. Yeah, I read them. I watched in-game videos too. But then why the side quests better structured and are more emotionally satisfying than the main plot? It feels like they had time and budget up to the midpoint, and then everything just stops. Why replace the climatic boss battle with a 10-minute shooting gallery? Who thought that was a good idea? I know people could argue it's an open ending, that it's meant to be this way, sure, but why do the optional bosses give me more excitement than the final mission? I can accept the abstractness of Polaris and Hedron. They are beings from other worlds without physical form. Fine. But the way the story tries to gaslight you into thinking it's deeper than it actually is, total nonsense. Cringe and bad taste. The real deal is, Control was made under serious constraints, financial and time-wise. Remedy themselves admitted it. The game had a budget of only 30 million euros, which is a low for a project of this scale. Development time, just 3 years. Compare that to Alan Wake 7 years and Quantum Break 5 years. Control was more of an experiment, and honestly, it needed at least 5 more hours of story content to feel complete. In its current form, the narrative is unfinished. Sorry, but anyone who thinks otherwise is just lying to themselves. And back to character writing, can you name a single side character from memory? I couldn't. Control is one of the loneliest games I've ever played in that regard. At first I thought that was intentional, that the isolation was the part of the mystery, that maybe the story would spiral into some mind-blowing twist. But no, Most likely, due to lack of resources, they just didn't have time to write anyone besides Jessie, and even she ended up bland. We get it. She's being watched and she has a brother, there's a mystery, but no emotional connection, no payoff. The world is fascinating. The paranormal stuff makes sense within its own logic, oddly enough. But how far can a game go relying only on that? For me, not far enough. The lack of strong story structure, meaningful character arcs, and proper attention to the entities driving the plot was a massive disappointment. I expected so much more. So what's the final verdict? I actually liked the game. In some ways, I regret sleeping on it for so long. It's got phenomenal action, a stunning aesthetic, and deeply intriguing world. After a few hours, Control completely hooked me until I finished the main campaign. But it's not without flaws. Like I said, it's just a rough diamond that just needed more polish, a stronger ending, and a more refined gameplay loop to boost replayability. Now I'm genuinely curious to see what they'll do in the sequel, how they'll expand it and improve it. Maybe in Control 2 they'll finally smooth out those rough edges and give us something truly phenomenal.